Welcome to the German Marshall Fund of the United States. My name is Heather Conley. I'm president of GMF, and we are absolutely delighted to be able to have an in-depth discussion about something we care deeply about at the German Marshall Fund, and that is the Marshall Plan. Over 75 years ago, US Secretary of State George Marshall outlined the European Recovery Program, or Marshall Plan, and it was considered one of the most important, consequential, and unique American diplomatic initiatives of the 20th century. The US provided transformative humanitarian and reconstruction assistance to 16 European countries in the wake of the devastation of the Second World War. The Marshall Plan gave hope to millions, and hope served as a democratic counterweight to the spread of communism across Europe. If the Marshall Plan is celebrating its 75th anniversary, that means that the German Marshall Fund is celebrating our 50th anniversary, because 50 years ago, we were created through an initial gift by the German government to thank the American people for the Marshall Plan and to make a unique investment in a stronger transatlantic relationship. So, as a living legacy to the Marshall Plan, the GMF believes the Marshall Plan contains pretty powerful lessons for Ukraine and Eastern Europe today. And I hope we can talk about that a little bit in our discussion. So let's get started. We're so grateful that Benn Steil is with us, someone who has thought very deeply about the Marshall Plan in his writing. And so without further ado, thank you for being with us. Let me turn this over to Rachel Tausendfreund, who is our editorial director at the German Marshall Fund. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to have this conversation today with Benn Steil. He is a senior fellow and the director of international economics, as well as the official historian in residence at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He's also the founding editor of International Finance, a scholarly economics journal, and the lead writer of the Council's Geographics economics blog. But as Heather mentioned, particularly important for today, he's a historian and the author of a book on the Marshall Plan called Marshall Plan, The Dawn of the Cold War. It was published in 2019, so right before we all entered the COVID void, and now he's doing a belated book tour because it was well-timed ahead of the anniversary. So Benn Steil, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
And this is probably not the last time I'll do this. This is not officially a book discussion, but I do want to say it's a really excellent book. You might be an economist, but you write like the best of historians. It was a pleasure to read.
Thank you, Rachel.
And so, I mean, let's start at the beginning. Heather mentioned it, right? We're hearing all kinds of calls now for a new Marshall Plan. In your book, you list, 5 or 6 different suggested Marshall plans. The German finance minister or development minister wanted to do a Marshall Plan for Africa, right? This is an idea that doesn't let people go. So why has it captured the imagination as it has, and why are we constantly hearing calls for imitations?
Well, if you consider the old original one, going back to 1947, when General Marshall made his speech, the Western European economies were in pretty dire straits. And when you consider the extent to which they recovered economically between 1947, at the time Marshall made his speech, in 1952, when the last US payments came through, it was about $160 billion in terms of current US dollars. Those economies did recover very dramatically. Output went up about 60%. Those Marshall countries that had been democratic before the war, and that was most of them, did successfully reestablish their democracies. Their publics rejected the extremes of the left and the right. In France and Italy, the communist parties were successfully pushed out of the coalition governments and did not come back in. They lost considerable popular support. On the right as well, there was a loss of support. It was an American priority also to discourage the French population, for example, for voting for the Gaullists, The Americans were fine with the center left, the center right, but they were trying to make sure that the extremes wouldn't come back. So if you take that as your background and you ascribe all those successes, economic and political, to the Marshall Plan, then you come away with the idea that we can solve remarkable geopolitical challenges all over the world, irrespective of geography, irrespective of time, etc., with a Marshall Plan.
I think we'll get into how much exactly the Marshall Plan did and how one could maybe or maybe not exactly imitate that. But to go back, to the origins of the Marshall Plan in terms of the economic goals that the Marshall Plan set out, what it envisioned in Europe economically, and also what it envisioned in Europe politically. What were the goals, and how did it meet them? Did it meet them?
Well, certainly in terms of the speed of the recovery in Western Europe broadly, I mean, there were significant variations among countries, but overall, the improvement in output was very dramatic and certainly did meet American expectations. The Truman administration wasn't always completely happy with the choices that the recipient countries made in terms of how to direct their money. For example, they wanted the French to devote more to fiscal and monetary stabilization, less to the so-called Monet plan for industrial modernization. In Italy, the Americans wanted the reverse. For the Italians to put less emphasis on stabilization and more emphasis on industrial modernization. But overall, they were very, very happy with the results. But the blueprint involved a heck of a lot more than just devoting money. The money was never envisioned, at least initially, as being more than a pump primer. It was only later in the process, after the Marshall Plan was legislated, that Keynesian economists in the Truman administration began to take over the mechanisms of the Marshall Plan and try to impose a Keynesian framework on how the Marshall Plan would revive these economies. In subsequent decades, you did have economists doing econometric exercises trying to pinpoint the exact form of Keynesian hydraulics that led to this recovery, and they really weren't able to do it. That is, from a Keynesian perspective, the Marshall Plan would only have accounted for a small portion of the remarkable improvement in economic performance in these countries. So what else was behind the Marshall Plan then besides the money? And one of the key features was European integration. European economic and political integration was actually a primary motivation of the US State Department. And to the extent that we look back on people like Jean Monnet today, rightly as being a founder of the modern European Union, it was also people like Will Clayton, who was Undersecretary for Economic Affairs at the State Department, who deserves to be thought of as one of these founding fathers. The French today, of course, are considered a great leader of European integration, and they did become so. But they had to be dragged kicking and screaming by the Truman administration into this idea. So European integration was a major component of the Marshall Plan. Germany, of course, was the linchpin of this, and convincing the French and the British in particular that they should integrate their economies with the West German economy was a very, very difficult proposition. And that perhaps is one of the greatest successes of the Marshall Plan.
So related to that, you, as the sort of subtitle of your book makes clear, or the second part after the colon, I mean, you make the argument very convincingly, the Marshall Plan, it was, of course, an aid package, but it was one important part of a grand strategy. You said European integration was part of that strategy, but if you imagine the whole strategy and Marshall Plan is part of it, what was the Marshall Plan doing and what was the strategy behind it?
Right. Well, the strategy did most definitely evolve over the course of the 4 years. If you consider the initial impetus It was the fact that the US had devoted an enormous amount of resources to European rehabilitation, humanitarian aid after World War II in 1946 and 1947, comparable to the annual sums devoted to the Marshall Plan. That was given through UNRWA, the new UN Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, but that was considered to be an abject failure politically, because Stalin was able to undermine the reestablishment of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, undermine economic reform, undermine the coalition governments that had been set up there. Yugoslavia shot down 2 US relief planes. So the Truman administration came to the conclusion that, first of all, they had to own the foreign aid administration. This couldn't go through UNRWA anymore. And second, it had to be focused on Western Europe. This was the defensible part of Europe that wasn't within Stalin's grasp, and that it had to be focused now on reconstruction. That is, to rebuild the productive capacity of Western Europe as quickly as possible, so that they could afford to take responsibility for their own defense. That the US had over 3 million troops in Europe at the end of World War II. President Truman was following through with President Roosevelt's commitment made at Tehran in 1943 to withdraw all these troops within 2 years of the end of fighting in Europe. The US defense budget collapsed from $960 billion in 1945 to $95 billion in 1948. So this was part of a strategy to set Europe, Western Europe, on its feet again as quickly as possible, to allow them to defend themselves. So we, the United States, could disengage militarily. It didn't work out like that at all. And so there was a major correction partway through the Marshall Plan. It came in formally in 1949. That is, the French and the British made a powerful case to the United States that they could not go forward with this US scheme for integration unless the US could provide firm security guarantees. Because if the French, for example, were responsible for defending its own borders, not just against the Soviet Union, but against a revived Germany, how would they do so if they didn't have, for example, their own steel industry? If each European country didn't have its own inefficient, autarkic steel industry, it was impossible. So the US was going to have to underwrite their security. And so the Truman administration reluctantly came to the conclusion that yes, security was going to have to be a major component of the Marshall Plan. And so in April 49, 1 year after the Marshall Aid legislation, the US signed NATO's Founding Act. And so if you view the Marshall Plan in a broader context as being part of a more comprehensive policy to bring security and economic rehabilitation to Western Europe, then most definitely it was a success. But you can't ignore that critical security component.
A critical security importance, NATO, which we're seeing again today, right? This is a key issue. We're going to talk about, possibilities for Ukraine a little bit later in the conversation, and that's, I think, going to be a key aspect. I want to briefly say to everyone watching, first of all, thank you very much for joining us, and I will open the conversation later to questions. So if you have any questions, you can start collecting them now, and later I'd love to pull you into the conversation. So Ben, on the sort of rebuilding of European economies, there is a narrative one hears in Europe a lot that, the Marshall Plan, a sort of cynical narrative. The Marshall Plan was a lot about supporting US exports. or that was the whole point, was a sort of export subsidy. But you talk about the role of exports and the sort of cooperation of U.S. business in the process. So can you talk a little bit about the role of U.S. business in the process and how the Marshall Plan, helped rebuild European industry?
Well, going back to 47 and the months leading up to Marshall's speech, there was a lot of concerned discussion in Washington about what would happen to the U.S. economy if the Western European economy completely collapsed. And that was a very necessary discussion to have because, of course, U.S. prosperity was going to be intimately linked with Western European prosperity. So no doubt, U.S. economic conditions were a vital element in thinking about how to put forward a plan for reviving the West European economies. Having said that, this cynical view, which was most definitely the one taken by Stalin and the Soviet Union, was not accurate at all. The Truman administration and the Marshall Plan administrators, people like Paul Hoffman, Averill Harriman, made absolutely clear that this was not going to be a boondoggle for U.S. exporters. And that was for the primary reason that one of the central aims of the Marshall Plan was to eliminate the so-called dollar shortage in Europe. That is, after the war, the Europeans were so dependent on imports from the United States, particularly of capital goods, and they had nothing with which to pay for it. Right? They don't have dollar stocks, they don't have gold stocks anymore, and they can't produce very much. So eliminating this dollar shortage was a key aim of the Marshall Plan. And the key mechanism of doing that was to restore Western Germany to its traditional role as the capital goods supplier for Europe in order to reduce European dependence on the United States. And the administration made clear publicly that this was not a gift to US exporters. That was not the aim of the plan. And US industry associations like the Chamber of Commerce, like the National Association of Manufacturers, really did get behind that message, sometimes in contradiction to their members' interest, and they had real arguments with their members. And they made public statements saying, unless we can rebuild a balanced economy in which the Europeans have the resources to pay for our exports, we'll never have long-term prosperity. So we have to view this as a long-term exercise. This was not a short-term exercise. It was not an opportunity for US exporters to find new business for a few years until the Marshall money dries up. That wasn't the aim here. And that took a major political education process in the United States. Many senators, Democrat and Republican, we had a Republican-dominated Congress at the beginning of the Marshall Plan, went to Europe to see conditions there, and that changed a lot of minds. Marshall himself and many other members of the administration, former members of the administration, were traveling all around the country, speaking to consumer groups, farmers groups, labor groups, religious groups, trying to educate them as to what this plan was about and why it was so vital, not just to the economic interest of the United States, but to the long-term security interest of the United States.
Thanks. I actually want to continue on this point of political education, or rather I want to sort of shift to the now and potentially future looking, which is, as we started saying, a year doesn't go by without someone wanting to suggest a Marshall Plan for something, and yet there hasn't really been any good imitation of the Marshall Plan since then. At least I would say so. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that. because it's in fact really hard to imitate for a variety of reasons. So I want to go through the different reasons and kind of the conditions that would be necessary, starting with the political. So both in terms of, what was necessary for the US, or what would be necessary if the US and the EU together were going to do a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, for example, or a Marshall Plan for climate. What's the political necessity, both on the giving side, but also on the recipient side?
Okay, well, there are a lot of requirements. One of which was very important to the Marshall Plan was that it not be based on debt. That is, we weren't going to loan even more money to heavily indebted countries. It was all based on grants, except, interestingly, for one country, and this is really interesting, with regard to Germany. American aid was officially classified as loans, not as grants. What was the reason? Did the Americans expect to get paid back by the bankrupt Germans? Absolutely not. This was to give us negotiating leverage with the French. The French were saying, well, the Germans owe us billions of dollars for unpaid bills before the war. They owe us billions in reparations. So the Americans, by classifying their Marshall aid to Germany as loans, were able to say to the French, look, we're now the senior creditor in Germany. Since no one gets paid a dime until we get paid back, and since we will never get paid back, you will never get paid back, you have a choice to make. Okay, you can continue to bang the table and demand reparations and repayment of old bills from Germany, and that will never be successful, or you can take the sure thing, Marshall aid. And the French chose the Marshall aid. So that's one requirement, that it not be based on dumping more debt on heavily indebted nations. That has never worked. But the security component, which I talked about briefly earlier, is absolutely critical. Although we never talk about a Marshall Plan in Iraq and Afghanistan, we actually spent $210 billion on reconstruction alone in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that compares with 160 billion in current US dollars for all the 16 Marshall nations. So it's not as if we haven't tried to use reconstruction aid as a tool for economic and political revival or reconstruction. It's that we failed. And why did we fail? In both cases, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the primary reasons were that we were unable to reestablish security. We were unable to defeat the Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan. We were unable to defeat the Iran-backed militias in Iraq. And this meant that the reconstruction aid was never going to generate the revival of private domestic investment and foreign direct investment that was integral to the recovery of the West European economies after World War II. So I would put primary emphasis on the reestablishment of security. Unless you can do that, economic rehabilitation and political reconstruction are almost certainly hopeless.
And what about the political conditions necessary in the receiving countries? Right, there has to be also some kind of structure that will ensure that the aid is used wisely and
Sure.
and smartly.
Well, that was relatively easy in the case of Western Europe, because these countries had a long tradition of a competent, reasonably non-corrupt civil service that were capable of implementing long-term economic plans. We didn't have to build that. That was there. We didn't have to build democracy in France and Britain. It had been there. In the case of Britain, of course, it it never went away. And so we had significant differences with them about how they should spend their money. But at the end of the day, it was really a debate about whether you should use asphalt or concrete when you rebuild roads. It really doesn't matter. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. That wasn't the big issue. The issue was whether they could build a coherent plan and spend the money responsibly. And they could, and they did. That was an easy job. In Iraq and Afghanistan, you never had this. So it was not just that we were trying to reconstruct the two countries physically. We were trying to build a political apparatus that had never existed before and had never been particularly friendly towards the United States and its aims and its traditions and its a cultural and political priorities. It was very foreign territory for us to operate in. Yeah, it's important to understand the context in which we were dealing, because the other recent episodes in which you've heard impassioned calls for Marshall Plans, for example, after the Arab Spring, in the broad Middle East, or in Syria, in the midst of a catastrophic civil war, you didn't have that context. North Africa, you don't have that context. So we don't have any experience with trying to reconstruct countries politically at the same time that we reconstruct them economically. So that's certainly another factor that needs to be strongly considered.
And then there are also both the politics, the political room for maneuver, and the sort of will that you saw, in those early post-Second World War years in the United States. I mean, you mentioned it was a Republican Congress and a Democratic president who worked really closely together, and the Republicans were, quite engaged, the leading Republicans. So, is that as imaginable in the sort of divided political landscape? And it seems a little bit more short-term. Everything seems a little bit more contentious. What would be necessary on that side?
You reminded me of a quote from Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. in 1947, writing to the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Arthur Vandenberg, who was certainly one of the heroes of the Marshall narrative, at least my Marshall narrative, saying that the reconstruction of Western Europe was a 20 to 50 year proposition. And I'm quoting him. He said, and the aid which we provide today and over the next 3 years will in the long run result in our having strong friends and allies abroad. So the aim was for the United States to provide for its own security by building an alliance of common-minded nations that would be with us in the long term, that would share a common vision for how we should approach challenges in the world. So this wasn't a short-term initiative. This was a long-term initiative. Now, there was certainly no love lost between the Republican Congress and the Truman administration. They had very different ideas and very different aims and different values, and they fought over the sort of same issues that we fight over today, about taxes and spending and cultural values, et cetera. And I can assure you that the Republican Congress in particular was in no mood for a new massive foreign aid program. But there were a few factors that brought them together. First, individuals really do matter. Arthur Vandenberg made very clear to General Marshall and to President Truman that they were going to have to do certain things that they didn't always like to do in order to bring along the Republican Congress, but that he, Senator Vandenberg, would do his job. And he did, and he sacrificed his presidential ambitions to do that. If they did their job, then he believed that this plan could be legislated. And without his cooperation and without the Truman administration dealing responsibly with the Republican Congress, it would have remained at just that, a plan. It would never have been legislated. But there were facts on the ground in Europe that convinced Republican congressmen that they had to act. Stalin considered the Marshall Plan. This is the root of the subtitle of my book, Dawn of the Cold War. Stalin considered the Marshall Plan to be a tremendous threat to his ambitions in Europe, because it suggested that the Americans weren't going home like they had after World War I, that they were staying. They were going to be engaged economically, politically, and he believed rightly, militarily. And they were going to revive the old enemy, Germany, and turn the western part of it into a capitalist democratic bulwark. And he tried his very best to undermine it. One of the things he did was to instigate a communist coup in Czechoslovakia in February 1948, which really had a galvanizing effect on Republicans in Congress. So at that point, they realized, look, we don't have the troops to do anything about this in Europe right now. And it's politically impossible to go pouring millions of American troops into Europe again to try to counter Stalin. We have to do something innovative and dramatic, and we have to do it immediately. And so it's not a particular surprise that they began coalescing quickly around the Marshall Aid package after this, and we get it in April of '48. This was also forward-looking because the Italian elections were coming up, and Republican congressmen, just like Democratic congressmen, were very concerned that the Italians would turn to the communists. And in fact, they didn't. It was a big victory for the center-right in Italy. And one of the factors that influenced the Italian elections most, not just the propaganda operations of the new CIA that was coming into being, but the prospect of Marshall Aid. The Italians understood well that if the communists were going to be part of the government, and the communists opposed the Marshall Plan, that aid wouldn't be forthcoming. So there were conditions on the ground in Europe that influenced both European public opinion, US public opinion, and the positions that the two major parties took in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, Stalin might have been the most right about what it would mean in terms of US long-term commitment to Europe, more so than even the Americans at the time envisioned.
Well, this is a great point that you're making. Remember, we didn't want to re-engage with Europe militarily. We were trying to give them enough money that they could do it all themselves. And Stalin said, no, that's not the way it's going to play out. And he was right. And there was clearly a dialectic going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. One would make a move which it would characterize as being defensive, which it was from its perspective. The other would consider it a threat and make another move. And of course, this threat almost got us into World War III. As you know, the Berlin blockade, and the way in which the United States chose to address it was a key episode in the Marshall Plan story.
And I'm wondering, with a view to, today, if we think about the importance of the containment strategy and the bigger strategy to sort of stand firm against the USSR. I mean, so much is different about today's. Let's, forward to a place where, Ukraine has come out more or less victorious from the war, so they still have a functioning state. I mean, the US is no longer the huge power that it was relatively in 1947. Russia is a different kind of, adversary. How do you see, first of all, let's say the sort of grand strategy in the context of a Marshall Plan for Ukraine,
right.
Again, after a successful end.
So let's do also
Comparatively.
acknowledge that the Marshall Plan had geopolitical costs. It wasn't all just gain to the United States. With regard to Ukraine, what's the end game? I don't know. You don't know. Nobody can predict perfectly. But I think one reasonable possibility, unfortunately, is some sort of Korean Peninsula armistice, right? With the Russians in control of the eastern part, perhaps Odessa, building this corridor going up from Crimea into the Donbass. And then Ukraine essentially controlling the western part of the country. Nobody wants to go into a situation like that. But how did the Korean Peninsula situation evolve? Believe it or not, in May of 1947, one of the fascinating things I found in the Russian archives when I was researching the book was that Stalin was so concerned about Germany that he wanted to get other problems with the United States off the table. And he actually instructed a Soviet negotiating delegation to reach agreement with the United States on the construction of a new integrated provisional government for Korea. So there would have been a unified Korea, at least for a period, not because Stalin had entered into some sort of kumbaya phase, but he was so anxious to make sure that the United States would not swallow Western Germany. It was his ambition to keep a unified Germany, which he would eventually take control over. After Marshall's speech, that cooperation collapsed, not just in Korea, but around the world. Fast forward to today, and it's fascinating that the adversary once again, unfortunately, is Russia. But the geographic context is different. It's further to the east. And this is where we can really take some lessons from the Marshall Plan, and they're uncomfortable lessons. It wasn't just Stalin who created the Iron Curtain across Europe. General Marshall and the Truman administration did too, not because they wanted to split Europe, but they decided very hard-headedly that there was a part of Europe that we were capable of defending, the western part, again, because of geography, that Stalin was several states removed from, for example, Paris and London, and there were certain states that we couldn't protect. And so there were robust debates within the Truman administration about what to do about Poland and Czechoslovakia, both of which wanted desperately to participate in the Marshall Plan. Stalin said no. When the Czechs refused to say no in a very clear manner, Stalin instigated a coup. And the State Department made this hard-headed decision that it was very unfortunate, but the United States was not capable of defending Czechoslovakia and Poland without having to resort to nuclear weapons. Sound like a familiar discussion? Now fast forward to today, and we're right up against Russia's borders, the adversary's borders. And as I emphasized earlier, security was a key component of the Marshall Plan's success. NATO was the key component behind that security. Ukraine very much wants to be a member of NATO and integrated into Western Europe through the European Union, again, consistent with this US vision. But who is the adversary that says no to both of these things? Once again, it's Russia. Russia had been against Western European integration. Russia had been against NATO, but they couldn't stop it because of the borders. These were borders the US was capable of defending. In Ukraine, these borders are much less amenable to US security guarantees. And the United States recognizes it reluctantly, so that NATO membership for Ukraine, at least for the moment, is off the table. simply as a practical matter, that we recognize that unless we're willing to engage in the a potential escalation of the conflict with Russia to nuclear weapons, that we were unable to provide that security to Ukraine. So to get to the bottom line, if we're going to have a genuine Marshall Plan for Ukraine with the long-term aim of integrating it into the West, economically, politically, militarily, Russia is going to, in some form, have to acquiesce to that. I personally find it unfathomable that President Putin would do that. Many have been speculating about what a post Putin Russia could look like. I personally don't think, that is a sort of Navalny-led Russia. It would still be a Russia that is probably fundamentally anti-Western. There isn't a ready democratic Western leading alternative there. I've actually seen some proposals on social media for a Marshall Plan for a post-Putin Russia. But again, unless Russia can somehow be brought to acquiesce in Ukraine's integration into the West, a Marshall Plan is probably beyond the scope of our reasonable aims. That's not to say that we shouldn't contribute enormous humanitarian aid. It is not to say we shouldn't contribute reconstruction aid, but we will have to be more modest in our long-term economic, political, and military aims.
So I want to again invite anyone who's interested, who's curious, who has a question for Ben to put your question in the Q&A. I think that would be better for me than raising hands. So I'd appreciate if you do the Q&A, but at any point now until the end of the conversation, I will take questions if there are questions. So, we talked about the very difficult security situation for Ukraine and that making, a one-to-one copy, unless something changes, pretty difficult to imagine. I want to also, because you are an economist after all, talk about, the economics of today. I mean, before you wrote your Marshall Plan book, you wrote a book about Bretton Woods system, and they were kind of a piece in terms of their economic vision,
yes,
upon which also aid was based. So, a lot of things have developed since then in terms of, free trade, global supply chain, and now we're rethinking some of that and stepping back a bit potentially from the, big push for free trade. So I'm wondering economically what's different about today in outlining such a plan.
Well, Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan were inconsistent in certain ways. Bretton Woods was the original Roosevelt one world view of what the post-war landscape would look like. That is, we would march forward in cooperation with the Soviet Union and China, which we of course had hoped would remain under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. That didn't work out too well. Whereas the Marshall Plan was quite openly a two-world vision that Truman was forced to adopt, us and them, the Marshall States and the Soviet Union and its satellites. But economically, there was a very similar vision. They were the two regimes were built on the notion that fixed exchange rates were here to stay. So when we talk about it being one of the aims of the Marshall Plan to eliminate the dollar shortage in Europe, we don't use phrases like that anymore. It was a dollar shortage. How could there be a dollar shortage? In a world of floating exchange rates, you don't have for all intents and purposes, at least among the wealthier countries, dollar shortages, floating exchange rates take care of that. So some of the things we did during the Marshall Plan, for example, the establishment of the European Payments Union, which operated from 1950 to 1958 to help reintegrate the European economies by allowing them to trade with each other on a fixed exchange rate basis, where there would be no credit risk. The United States would underwrite all that. There would in fact be no money moving back and forth across borders unless imbalances went beyond a certain level. In other words, again, the United States was underwriting all the credit risk in the mechanism. That sort of thing is probably unnecessary in today's macroeconomic context. But other features of the Marshall Plan certainly relevant. I mean, the whole idea of integrating the European economies, of course, became the foundation of the European Union. And the European Union is an outgrowth of the Marshall Plan. And what would we like, for example, for Ukraine? No doubt for it to be economically and politically integrated with the European Union. At least that's the long-term vision. So that aim of the Marshall Plan, very relevant to today. It's just more difficult to achieve in this geographic context. You know, if General Marshall were looking at this situation today, I think he would be pouring cold water on the idea of a Marshall Plan. That is, he would not be against humanitarian aid by any means. He would not be against reconstruction aid, but he would never present it to the American public as being anything akin to the Marshall Plan, which is, by the way, a term he never used. It was the European Recovery Program.
Well, humble guy, I guess. They didn't want to put his name over. I think it must have been in your book that I read. Truman insisted that it carry his name to make it politically more palatable, because
yes,
in fact,
after Marshall's speech, it's quite an interesting story. Truman's primary political advisor, Clark Clifford, came to him and said, you know, I think this thing has legs and it could work for you politically. We should call it the Truman Plan. And Truman scoffed and said, well, don't be ridiculous. He said, anything going before Congress bearing my name will, quote unquote, twitch a few times, go belly up and die. But he said, and I quote again, even the worst Republican could not vote against the plan named for the general. So that was a very wise political judgment.
Good. And also good branding. So we've talked about the difficulties, you know, Marshall Plan for Ukraine, which is the sort of most pressing at the moment. But, you know, there's a Marshall Plan idea for everything. What about other sort of big challenges like climate, right?
Yeah,
if you wanted to sort of build global partnerships and stick on these principles of sort of making partners stronger, having a 20 to 50 year plan to, you know, make progress together with others to conquer a big challenge and be strategically more competitive together with partners. Does it make sense here? Where does it work and where does it not work?
Look, a Marshall Plan for climate. There's no doubt that combating climate change is going to take enormous international cooperation. It's going to take an enormous amount of money. And in that regard, it's tempting to look at the Marshall Plan. But the context really is very different. We're not talking about an alliance of like-minded nations here. We're talking about the world, including some very major players, in particular China, who don't share our values and apparently don't want to be integrated into the sort of global political and economic sphere that we've been building since the Second World War. They have a different vision, and in that regard, you know, the Marshall Plan view is vision is not really apt. I think one of the downsides of using the Marshall Plan as your touchstone is the idea that it's just a matter of money. If you're willing to put enough money behind something, you can solve any problem. The money was important in the case of the Marshall Plan. I wouldn't deny that at all, but it wasn't the fundamental feature. You know, we talked about European integration. We talked about the reversal of US occupation policy in Germany, going from the Morgenthau Plan to a deindustrialized Germany, doing a complete 180 and trying to reindustrialize it as fast as possible. Building alliances of like-minded countries. These were central to the success of the Marshall Plan, and the types of challenges the world is facing in, for example, climate change. Very, very different. The one concern I have is about constantly referring to the Marshall Plan is that it gives people who aren't completely familiar with the story, the notion that it's just a matter of committing a very large amount of money. It can be much more than that, and it can be much less than that. For example, as you know, with regard to climate change, economists who believe absolutely that climate change is happening are often against very expensive schemes to address climate change, government-funded schemes, and prefer instead to price carbon, to have things like carbon taxes, so that the natural mechanism of the market, once we price carbon correctly, will drive us in the right direction. So again, it's not just government money. And if we're going to use the Marshall analogy, we should disabuse ourselves of the notion that it's just about committing a large enough sum of government money. It's much more than that in some cases, and it's much different from that in other cases.
Yeah, I thought that was a, really well done in your book. And we're, as Heather said, it's kind of our legacy, the Marshall Plan. And so in the anniversary year, we're doing lots of things, and we're working on a collection that also you contributed to, that wants to sort of underscore that point and say, so often when the Marshall Plan is invoked, it's invoked as just a bunch of money, as kind of aid in a general sense. Whereas it needs to be a strategy. It needs to be a very sort of clear-eyed strategy.
A coherent strategy too.
Yeah. Clear-eyed, coherent. But what I find, I think why the Marshall Plan is partially so compelling is that it has this, first of all, it included the vanquished foe, right? There's a kind of, kindness, self-enlightened, far-seeing, of course. It wasn't just kindness, but there's this idea of, including also the losers of something in order to reach a goal, and the, generosity of it. So in that sense, I think it's interesting to think about that part of strategy, and also this idea of strengthening partners.
And in the case of Germany, bringing in the losers, that wasn't pure Christian beneficence, you understand. And that was really controversial. Many progressives at the time were staunchly against this component of the Marshall Plan because it involved moving away from our denazification program. In other words, there were compromises that had to be made. If you wanted to revive the West German economy as quickly as possible, guess what? That implied leaving a lot of key personnel in place, many of whom were open Nazis. So this involved some significant moral trade-offs too. This wasn't just the United States saying, kumbaya, now we have to come together, and all good-willed people of the world shall combine and bring their energies to the task. No, we had to make some significant moral compromises in order to make this vision work. If we're to promote any sort of Marshall vision for Ukraine, we're going to have to make these sort of compromises too. For example, if we really don't want the Russia to wreck our program, we're going to have some sort of accommodation with them. Because remember, again, it wasn't the Marshall money, the government money was just a pump primer. Okay, the idea was to revive private investment, which couldn't possibly be matched by US government capital. And the Republicans in the US Congress were not going to quote unquote fund socialism, as they put it. Well, in the case of Ukraine, if you want that private investment to come in, private investors, domestic and foreign, have to believe that their investments will not be subject to rapid expropriation or destruction. So again, there's going to have to be some understanding with Russia, some sort of accommodation, not out of moral concerns or, you know, kumbaya concerns, peace to the world, bringing everybody in, as a pure practical matter, given that Russia will always be Ukraine's neighbor, no matter what we do, no matter how much money we commit. We are going to have to make some very, very difficult political compromises in order to ensure that the money we invest in Ukraine is productively invested.
And we would have to have, you know, a very clear vision for what we want to do. We do have the right before the deadline a question, so I'm going to give you that question quickly, which is the questioner is asking, there seem to be big differences in the effect of the Marshall Plan from country to country. You know, if we compare maybe Germany to Italy or France, can you talk a little bit about that? What were the factors for the kind of different levels of success we saw in the different Western economies?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps the biggest disappointment, and it's a country we haven't discussed it at all yet, for the United States was Britain. Britain had a Labour government at the time, which was well to the left of the democratic regime, capital D democratic regime in the United States. And they were busy nationalizing key components of industry in their country. And the Truman administration was staunchly against this, really staunchly against this. They thought it was deeply misguided and was going to set back Britain's economic recovery. Britain chose to use its Marshall aid very differently from France and Italy. It used it to pay off debt. And if the United States had wanted to, it could have really turned up the pressure on Britain and said, look, we're going to cut off the aid, because we did cut off aid to France a few times, but we let them have it back because we realized there was no good alternative to the coalition government there. In Britain, we could have said, you need to stop nationalizing industries. But we didn't. And that was a conscious choice made by the State Department, that it was in America's long-term interest to support the so-called NCL, non-communist left in Western Europe, because it had democratic legitimacy. Not because we believed in their economic program, but because the public was behind it. And that was what was important, that the European publics needed to understand that the United States was not imposing anything on them, that the United States was supporting liberal democracy. So we let it go. And the British recovery was not as good as, for example, the West German recovery. And we put our thumb on the scale in West Germany. General Lucius Clay, who was the military governor in Germany, for example, was a staunch capitalist. And he was quite interventionist to make sure that the Social Democrats in Germany didn't follow the British model and nationalize industries in Germany, at least until Germany, the western part of it that we controlled, was unified, until we'd created the country, because he hoped that Konrad Adenauer and the CDU would take power and they would pursue a very different agenda. So, you know, that political component of it was very significant. The United States was not always happy with the choices its recipient countries made. No doubt, if we did have a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, we would have similar debates with them. We would continue to have debates with them about corruption in the country, et cetera, what their long-term plans were, whether all their processes were democratic, whether they were pursuing a sensible industrial policy, exchange rate policy, monetary policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think one of the key lessons of the Marshall Plan was that we needed to make democratic legitimacy the foundation. In other words, we had to accept that the local populations that receive the money will have different preferences from ours, but we needed to show that their publics that we were not imposing an American or Western vision upon them, that it could be homegrown as long as it was consistent with democratic principles.
That sounds like also a very good guiding principle, right? It needs to underscore democratic legitimacy. It needs to be long-term, clear-sighted, and in fact, the commitment might end up being a lot longer term than we even envision it to be, as it turned out with Europe. So I like to end things punctually, and we are coming in almost exactly on time. Thank you very, very much, Benn Steil, for this really interesting talk. We could have talked 2 more hours about the aspects of conditionality, for example. There's a lot of fun grist there. But thank you for taking the time, and thank everyone who joined us for the conversation. And keep watching Benn. He'll be talking about his book a lot and his thoughts about the Marshall Plan. And we at GMF will be having lots of content, both on what we can learn from the history and ideas moving forward in this important year, and on important topics like Ukraine, but not only. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel.